Thank you, Peter, for that kind introduction, and thank you everybody for enduring my English, and apologies for that. As you can see, I have my own architectural intervention on my leg here, which is why I am speaking to you about architecture and not about skiing, because you can see from this that I have no expertise in skiing. And but I'm going to be talking about a little bit about architecture as it pertains to immigrant districts in cities and integration. And particularly the ways that architecture is created by immigrants themselves, particularly by low-income immigrants in cities, and the ways that architects in their practice can intervene both to improve and to create spaces that make integration work better, and to transform spaces that aren't working well into spaces where integration does work better. My unit of study, and you'll see in the exhibition, you've probably seen that we're examining a lot of spaces where that happens, how immigrant districts are created, and how they transform, and what principles make them work. So my unit of study is what I call the arrival city, which is a city within the city where clusters of people from the same immigration background live in proximity to one another. An arrival city can be a place with many different ethnicities. I mean, we have an examination of Offenbach there, which contains arrival cities for maybe 12 major ethnic groups, many of them interlinked, where they help each other integrate, they loan each other money, they do business together, they link themselves into the economy and education system and political system of the city so that the next generation can be European and German and so on. So we're looking at the ways that immigrants use the materials of the city around them to create spaces for integration and inclusion. But let's start on the other side of the world, taking a look at, in the countries where housing is not built by governments or by private agencies, how immigrants create spaces for inclusion for themselves. So let's start. This is in probably the fastest growing city in the world, in Dhaka, Bangladesh. I took this picture from on top of a high-rise, a middle-class high-rise building that any German person would be comfortable living in. And this in Gulshan, which is the middle-class area in the center of the city, and this is a place called Karail. We're looking down here. That was it was an empty piece of municipal land in 1995, and now it has maybe 30,000 people living in it who've come from rural villages in northern Bangladesh and built their own housing here. They like to live here because you can get work in the service industries of the middle class area, and also because they've set up an economy within this slum that is quite vibrant. It looks very unpleasant, and it is very unpleasant. It doesn't smell nice. During monsoon season, it is particularly insalubrious. And but why do people choose to live there? First of all, they're making about 20 times more money than you could in any rural village. Second of all, because they own the shacks they live in, not legally, but they bought them off whoever illegally subdivided the land, and they can borrow money based on the rising value of their slum shack and use that money to educate their children or start a small business. Inside the slum, there's a complex network of businesses and so on. There's a whole metalworking area. There's actually a garment fabrication business inside the slum. Bangladesh, of course, has the lowest wages of the garment industry in the world, but the people in this slum managed to undercut that significantly by saving money they've made working in garment factories and setting up their own little garment factories that don't officially exist and doing it. So there's, within what looks like chaos, there's actually quite a complex system of economic organization. And my main source of statistical information about this slum came from the key figure in South Asian slums, who's the cable wala, the guy who provides cable television to the slum dwellers, none of it legal, of course, and so on, but who knows more about people than anyone. In the favelas of Rio, you see a similarly complex set of organization built up and down vertical surfaces that nobody would want to build housing on in the normal economy because it's up and down the side of a cliff, which is why the slum dwellers live there, because there's accessible land that they're not going to get evicted from. You often in asking why immigrants settle in particular parts of cities, you need to ask the question of where is the place in the city where the housing costs less than it ever should in the city? And Then you need to ask the question of why did the housing cost less than it should? Sometimes it's up and down the side of a cliff or on the edge of a sewage-filled lagoon. Sometimes it's just a long tram ride from the center of the city, because as planners and architects and so on, the question of why the housing was so much cheaper often answers the question of what's going to go wrong in the future with these neighborhoods. Because an arrival city is a place that provides the bottom rung on the ladder to urban success. And it often fails in the future because the second and third rung on that ladder are missing. And the thing that made it so much cheaper than anywhere else is often the thing that is going to make the second and third rung missing. So the favelas of Brazil have this problem that it's very difficult for customers to get up to your business because it's up and down the side of the cliff. By introducing cable cars and things like that into them, the governments were able to inject a working economy into these districts and so on. In China, large parts of the population live in places like this, Liugang in Chongqing, which is a city of 20 million in the center of China. This is a self-built slum created by villagers from Sichuan who've come in, built their own housing, and it contains maybe 200,000 people who don't legally exist, who officially on the statistical register are all rural farmers living in Sichuan. And behind those houses, you see enormous industries. You'll see plastic fabricating shops that employ 40 people run by the slum dwellers. You'll see shops that contain 30 or 40 computer-controlled milling machines making motorcycle parts and so on. Enormous amounts of industry take place, none of which officially exists, none of which pays taxes, all of which provides a huge source of income for the people in them. So these are people taking the materials around them, the space around them, and creating their own internal economies for self-integration into the urban economy. Their goal usually is to get their children into the official education system, to get themselves established enough that they can buy a house somewhere else in the city, or improve this improvised district enough they can live there. So let's shift from that question of how immigrants create their own bottom rung on the ladder in the eastern and southern quarters of the world into the question of how they do it here. Most immigration takes place in what I call the arrival city districts of European cities, where immigrants locate whatever housing they can afford, and then they modify the spaces around them to form a type of economy that works for them. So this is on Handelsstraat in Antwerp, an interesting place with many different ethnic groups have set up, as you can see. And why do people live there? Because it has a cost of housing that for some reason is lower than anywhere else, and where there's a set of things. I mean, I would say there are three things that make people decide where to immigrate when they come to a country. The first thing is a network of people from a similar cultural or linguistic background. You want to live near them because they're the people who will loan you money, who will let you sleep in their house before you get your own housing, who will help you get your relatives immigrated there, who will help you set up a small business, and who will help you integrate, essentially. The second thing they look for is known employment or entrepreneurial opportunities. So information they get over SMS from back in whatever country they came from their relatives in Europe, saying, we know that you can get jobs in Offenbach doing this, or we know that there's a street that needs a kebab shop and you could probably start one here like you did back at home, and that sort of thing. So the second thing is opportunities to make money. And the third thing is housing that you can afford even though you're somebody who cannot possibly afford the rent in the city you're moving into. Now, I should point out, of those three things, the one thing that immigrants are willing to drop from that list is the third thing. Immigrants will settle in a place that they cannot afford to live if there are networks of people from the same background, and if there are business opportunities. People will happily live 8 people to a room if it provides them an opportunity. People will not move to a place where the housing is cheap or free if there's no economic opportunities. If there's a place that has abandoned or unused housing, it means immigrants don't want to go there because whatever caused the housing to be abandoned or unused means that there's no economy, and so on. So I mean, Antwerp's not a cheap city. This immigrant district is a few steps away from the Diamond District. It doesn't have particularly cheap rent, but they cluster there because there's lots of people who can help them make a living and make it up in the world. But often these places fail, particularly because today most immigration in Western countries is suburban. The inner cities like this in Antwerp or like Kreuzberg in Berlin and so on are now popular enough because of the success of previous immigrants or the lower, I mean, Brooklyn, New York was the consummate immigration district for the Western world. There were more immigrants groups passing through Brooklyn every decade than any other place in the world because it was cheap. It was the place you could get you arrive dirt poor and distrusted and hated and get your children into university and so on. Now, because those immigrants were so successful, Brooklyn is now the second most expensive place to live in North America after Manhattan. So forget it, unless you're Ryan Gosling, you can't live there or something like that. So most immigration is to suburban places that are not very well designed for this type of life. And I'd like to talk about what architects can do to create spaces like this that are good and what they can do in terms of interventions. So yes, here we have the classic arrival city districts of cities, Lower East Side of New York, which has seen multiple ethnic groups. The first poor and hated ethnic group to pass through the Lower East Side of New York and go from poverty to success were the Germans. Who in the early 19th century were considered vile and filthy and distrustful, and they made their way through the street vendor shops of these places and so on. Then they moved, then it was the Central and Eastern European Jews, then the Italians, Greeks, Chinese, Bengalis, et cetera, who have used the Lower East Side and so on. Same with Belleville in Paris. It's been used by multiple series of groups to integrate. Same with Whitechapel, Spitalfields in London, and Neukölln in Berlin, and so on, for example. People using the space. And notably, even as places like Neukölln have become more expensive, people continue to pass through them because there's these networks of connection. So what can architects do? This is an example that we have in the exhibition here. And of course, he's probably one of the most famous architects in the world, Alejandro Aravena. He in fact organized the Biennale this year and judged it and so on. So he's well known. He took an approach where he said, let's start before the immigrants arrive. Let's give them the resources they need to create their spaces. Let's build raw frames of cinder block that they can then use as they wish, and let the immigrants create their own frontages, modify the spaces as they wish. And in fact, if you saw a photo of this even 10 years later, you'd see these much more customized and so on. Now, of course, he was working in warm countries where thermal design isn't so important. Concrete blocks are not great thermal instruments. We should note that the R factor of cement is negative, in fact. It's a conductor of cold air, so you couldn't really use that here. But this idea of providing the raw materials, what the World Bank used to call sites and services. Sometimes you just have a concrete slab with sewage connections and plumbing and electricity connections, and you let people build whatever they want. Could you picture this being done in a German city? Might be an interesting idea. And in fact, one example of something like that happening in a German city was what they did in the southern so-called French quarter of Tübingen, which had become an immigrant district, and it had a whole lot of old airplane factories and things like that, and it was sort of a mixture of students. It's a university town and immigrants and so on. And the architects and planners said, let's take a look at what immigrant districts that are successful, like the Lower East Side or Whitechapel, Spitalfields, what do they look like? What physical spaces do they have? And how could we reproduce? They said, first of all, there's a very high population density. People live tightly together with little courtyards where they share space. Every house has access to the ground, and the bottom floors are always places that could be used for a shop or a restaurant or a factory. Whatever you want, no controls over those things. And they said, let's let the bottom floor be these things. And people set up a variety of shops and restaurants and factories and whatever they want in these spaces. And it's become a very popular and very successful district because it has a feeling a little bit like the medieval quarters of European cities, which had the similar unplanned, unzoned, chaotic space in them, and so on. Now, here is Western Amsterdam, which was a nice example of sort of park city planning in the 1950s, built on the idea that the working class people of Amsterdam wouldn't want to live near the horrible canals of central Amsterdam. They'd want to live out in a nice apartment district far away from the central city. And almost from the beginning, as in many other cities, it wasn't working class people moving out from Amsterdam who lived there, it was people from places like Morocco and Turkey moving in toward Amsterdam, looking at the city as their symbolic goal, who ended up living here. And this was designed around the great planning principles of the 1950s. Big, grassy, empty spaces between buildings, low population density, windy streets, big park belts separating the neighborhood from the established city, and strict zoning separation of residential and industrial and commercial so they don't touch each other. So in other words, it was almost perfectly designed for the failure of immigrants. They could not do any of the new immigrant things that you like to do. If you wanted to set up a shop on the ground floor of your building, there's no physical space to do it, there's rules that say you can't do it, and even if you somehow did do it, there's no customers walking past from the middle class districts to buy your stuff and eat at your restaurant because the population density is so low. And no surprise, this neighborhood spiraled into failure. I mean, the guy who shot the filmmaker Theo van Gogh and created a political crisis that the Netherlands is still experiencing came from one of these buildings on this street, and so on. So the city said, okay, wisely they said, there's a crisis in these suburban apartment block districts, and it's partly an architectural crisis. It partly has to do with the built form of this neighborhood, and it partly has to do with the fact that there's a low population density and a lack of connection to the rest of the city. So they demolished a lot of these buildings, and they replaced them with this. They said, let's look at the Lower East Side or something like that. Let's create that. Let's have 8, 9, 10, 11-story buildings on strict grid streets connected directly with no park in between to the city, and the bottom 2 floors of these buildings shall be spaces that can be retail or industrial or commercial or whatever you like. And not only that, but some of these spaces will be, some of the apartments will be designed so that they're expensive, so that they're not rental apartments or social housing, but they cost 300,000 or 400,000 euro to purchase, so that middle class people, as one of the planners said to me, we want the yuppies to move in. Middle class people from the established city will want to move in. Young creative people, computer businesses, artistic people will want to move in and create a social mix, create people who will be employers, be influences, and that sort of thing. What I found interesting was when I visited this project 10 years after it was first conceived. Last year I was in this part of Amsterdam, and to see how it had developed. Much to their surprise, they found it wasn't just the yuppies moving in from central Amsterdam who were buying up these apartments, but the Moroccan and Turkish families who made a little bit of money in their small businesses and had entered the middle class. They were buying up these flats because they were previously, if you were an immigrant family and you were successful, as soon as you got into the middle class, you moved out of this district and you went into a so-called white middle class district. And it was bad for the schools because you were moving your kids out of the schools and the schools were failing and so on. Now the immigrant families were saying, great, we can buy a flat in our own district, we can be middle class in the place that we first settled, and it's creating a social and economic mix within the area. I should add that the sale of these flats also financed some part of the redevelopment. This is still continuing. It's probably one of the biggest architectural interventions in public housing in Europe right now. And it encompasses tens of thousands of apartments. Here's an example of something they did within that area. They realized that the big grassy spaces between apartment buildings were threatening, that they were a problem, that it was a particularly gendered form of isolation there. Women who were living in these apartments were afraid to walk out of their building at night because they had a sense that there were threatening people in gangs in the grassy areas always look nice on architectural renderings. You always stand there with the architects, and in the rendering, there's pictures of the grassy area, and there's little clusters of circles of people just randomly talking to each other and so on. And then in real life, you never see those clusters of people except at night when they're hiding behind a tree and selling drugs or something like that. So there was that sense. So some of these places, they didn't demolish these buildings, which to be frank, were actually fairly nice examples of 1950s and 60s design, and people liked the apartments within them. So in some neighborhoods, instead of demolishing the buildings, they put stuff in the empty spaces. They put other housing, they put libraries, they put houses, they put some areas that could just be a souk, could be an improvised market, and that sort of thing. Fill in the empty spaces, and we'll see more examples of that. Often the problem with the places where immigrants settle in Western cities now is that they are isolated from the rest of the city. They are one stop beyond the end of the tram line or something like that. And in many cities you see that. You'll see the maps we have there of the maps of the Frankfurt area and the maps of Berlin showing the rental prices as you move along the tram line or and so on. The rents go down and down and down, and then if they actually showed one stop beyond the end of the tram line, that's where the rents get low enough that new immigrants settle. And the problem is, first of all, you have a job cleaning an office or something like that. It takes you 3 bus connections and an hour and a half to get to work, and then another hour and a half to get back. What happens to your children while they're happening? They use that empty space between the buildings as their childcare, and they join a gang or something like that. Not only that, you start a nice ice cream shop or something that in anywhere else in the city would be famous and everyone would go to it. If people have to take a long bus, your business is never going to succeed. So as they learned in Sao Paulo here, if you put in a high-speed bus line that runs every 15 minutes, you can transform the economic future of a district. And we see European examples of this. This is a famous project in Barcelona. This is an area of large slab apartment towers that were created really without any planning in the post-war decades. They'd become the major settlement area for many immigrant groups that were very physically isolated from the famous parts of Barcelona, and that also were physically isolated from each other. They didn't have any space. So what the redevelopment did was it took this had been a ravine in the middle here that was used for parking of cars and for teenagers doing no good, right? And nobody wanted to go into this ravine after dark for obvious reasons, and aside from parking, and it basically kept people. So not only did they build a metro station in there, but they created a physical space that turned that ravine into a unifying and attracting thing. They said, we're not just creating a metro station to get people out of this neighborhood so they can get a job in the city. We want to use this metro station to attract people to Newberry's, to this district, so that people want to go here. They want to go to the ethnic restaurants and shops. They want to go dancing here. They want to experience the culture. And they turned that empty space into an attraction unto itself that people would want to go to. So a transportation hub serving 3 purposes: as a way for people to get out and connect themselves to the established economy, as a way for people to get in, and for the established economy to connect itself to the place, and third, as a destination unto itself, as a place that invited different uses. That it wasn't designed for specific use, it was created as a space that could be used for many things. My final example is one from the city that I'm living in now, in Toronto. This was a big area called Regent Park, which was one of those 1950s things that Americans called the projects. It was, a cluster of mid-rise apartment buildings created to be social housing in the 1950s that at first seemed very successful, but then it experienced a spiral of downward failure. And you could see why partly. But the biggest problem, of course, was that it was entirely low-income people, because the housing policy there is that social housing is only available to people on very low incomes who tended to be new immigrants, and they would get trapped in cycles of intergenerational poverty for a number of reasons. First of all, there was no economy going on around here. As with the Amsterdam example, there was nowhere to start it. But also because you had a huge area of only low-income people, nobody opened any supermarket anywhere near there. You had to drive for half an hour to get anywhere you could buy fresh vegetables. And it meant that the poor immigrants who lived there had to go to some corner shop that only sold cigarettes and cans of soup, which at 5 times the cost of supermarkets, to buy any kind of food, because there was no middle class there that would cause anybody to want to open a supermarket. The empty spaces, nobody had any sense of ownership of them. So again, gangs would be there. People didn't want to go there at night. And a lot of fairly aspirational people got trapped there. And again, you had an architectural intervention where the idea was to recreate the idea of a city block that had existed before this place, to quadruple the population density, so the number of people living in the block increased 4 times, part of a general urban realization that the problem with apartment projects is actually, unless you're in Manhattan, the problem with apartment projects is they have a low population density, not a high population density. There aren't enough people there to form networks, to have a lively life on the streets, and they create dangerous spaces. But they also realize that both in order to finance this project, in order to create a social mix, once again, a quarter of those new units would be expensive condominium apartments that middle class people would buy, either middle class people rising up from the immigrant ranks or middle class people moving in. I mean, I would say it was success, and so you have a whole mix of different types of housing, income levels, ownership tenure forms, social housing, private rental housing, condominium ownership housing, and things that can change status as well. So pathways to buy your social housing unit and that sort of thing. And people from different backgrounds who are established and so on. I mean, when I was a student, I lived next door to this project when it was the project. And I would never have thought of going in there other than to visit people and so on. I wouldn't have socialized. Now I actually, with my small children, well, they're not that small anymore. With my children, I drive across the city to go to the swimming pool inside this project because it's one of the greatest swimming pools in the city, and my kids want to go in there at night and so on. As sort of a middle-class guy and so on, I feel my kids are actually safer inside this low-income housing project than they are inside my own neighborhood. They can go walk home from the swimming pool on their own and that sort of thing. And for the people who live there, there's that sense of safety. You're living in a neighborhood where people desire to go there instead of desire not to go there. And partly it was interventions in education. The school that was right next door to there had been one of those schools where everybody tries to get out of the school to if they're successful immigrants at all, they try to register their kids in a middle-class school in a more white district in the city. They intervened in the school. They said, let's create a school in this district that is not just up to the average standards of the city, but it is way above the average standards of the city, so that middle-class kids from the wealthy neighborhoods will be wanting to take the subway across the city to get admission to this school in the immigrant district. So the kids in the immigrant district actually have to compete to get admission to their own local high school against middle-class kids. So it becomes an aspiration to try to get admission to your own school rather than an aspiration to try to drop out at the earliest possible age and so on. So you're essentially turning a neighborhood that felt like a place of failure and a place you wanted to escape into a place that attracts people from across the city and that you feel proud to live in, that people want to stay in and want to compete to try to get into it. So it's partly an architectural thing, it's partly urban planning, it's partly educational policy and that sort of thing, but it's a way to use the physical space to transform part of a city and to look at the ways that immigrants use the urban space. And all of these projects are interesting because they essentially look at the life that people are trying to live, the dotted line that's in their minds between the village they came from, the place they're living now, and their imagined place in the future. And it's following that dotted line, and rather than saying, these people are failures, they've fallen into poverty, it says, where was that dotted line headed? And what were the obstacles that got in the way of that line that was in their minds? What were the things that stopped them on the trajectory that they had in their minds when they got off an airplane and arrived in the country? And what can we do to remove those obstacles in their way? Some of those obstacles are physical in the built form of the city. Some of them are institutional in rules that prevent you from doing the types of business and things that you want to do. Some of those things are policy in things like schools and things like that, the ability to borrow money and things like that. So what I'm saying is that the projects that seem to work best are interventions that are not designed to impose a vision on people's lives, but that are designed to remove obstacles from the trajectory that they know that their lives are on. Thank you very much.